say congratulations to all the students in the class of 2004.
Ditto.
This is the class of 2004 from Ray County High School in Evansville, Tennessee.
Freshman year, at lunch, I spilled milk all over my crotch and looked like I peed myself.
Now, I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but recently it has become pretty trendy for old recordings from the early 2000s to resurface, with everyone in the comments talking about how much better those times were in just about every way. While scrolling through these comments, one of them stood out to me the most. It reads, "I did grow up in the 90s. No matter what you say, a fact is a fact. Families were closer then. At the very least, they spent more time together. Anyone could get a job at 18 and make a living and buy a house. Food was real. Drugs weren't killing as many people as they do now. College was affordable. Cars were affordable. Rent was affordable. Music was real. No auto-tune or fake digital crap, and people could actually play instruments. Music could make you feel emotions. Suicide rates were lower. Crime was lower. It's not an opinion, it's fact. The 90s and 2000s were a better place to live." What's that? This isn't a comment under a video about the 2000s, but is actually under one about the 1970s?
This is unreal. Isn't this disgusting? Why doesn't anybody contact the president? Why is he letting this happen to us?
You know, the decade with historic stagflation, an oil crisis, unprecedented political controversy, and when the economy was so bad that the most powerful city in the nation was burning down and going bankrupt. These are the glory days we so desperately want to return to. Oh, and you, the viewer, wouldn't have even noticed if I didn't mention it wasn't about the 90s. The fact of the matter is this comment could pass for being about the 80s, 90s, noughties. Hell, I've even seen similar things said about the early 2010s. What I think many people don't understand is that this is a tale as old as time. The trope about the good old days and how back then, especially when we were younger, the world was just objectively better. Our parents bask in the memories of the big hair and rock of the 80s. Our grandparents long for the uniformity of the pre-counterculture era. But now it's Millennials and Gen Z's turn to experience senility, as we too become drunk on nostalgia and obsess over an idyllic past that never existed.
Do you recall not long ago when you would walk on the sidewalk?
Today I wanted to talk about why we are so obsessed with the past, our childhood, and why no matter how bad things may have objectively been in that past, we still seem to see them in such a glorious light. This is a recording of what the brain sees. What we are looking at is a reconstruction of a patient's brain activity while watching different Hollywood trailers. This was done by having subjects watch hours of trailers while in a functional MRI machine, which then recorded levels of activity around the brain and decoded and translated it into these images. Now, I don't know how scientifically legit this was or is, but it did remind me of something quite interesting. Now, I know you're like, what the hell does Stevie Nicks or 80s music have to do with this? But it kind of reminds me of a pothead-like idea I had, that one of the reasons older media inherently feels so nostalgic no matter your age is because of their grainy, blurry resolution and how our thoughts possibly present themselves in a similar low-res way. Now, I know some of you are probably like, well, no shit, older media feels nostalgic because it's literally just older in general. And while that is true, I would still point out that even today, younger people will use grainy filters to represent that something was a long ago memory, despite never living through the times where that technology was common. Again, it's obvious that this could just be to replicate the lower quality of video back then, but I still think that maybe our memories also exist in the same way, and the further back they are, the more fuzzy and grainy they get, making low quality retro video feel like a universally accurate method to convey that something is an older, childhood-like memory. So right off the bat, a huge reason the past, and especially your childhood, is so idyllic in your memories is simply because you're delusional. Now, this isn't just me insulting you, but is also largely agreed upon psychology. In psychoanalyses, nostalgia is considered not only as a longing for the past, but a longing for an idealized past for a moment that never actually existed. The screen memory, as Freud conceived, is a combination of different memories, an inaccurate account of the past in which memories are included or overlooked after the fact. Nostalgia, a concept for which memory is at the heart, is triggered by an evocation of something we recognize from our past. We must consider, however, that this moment or feeling that we recall may in fact be airbrushed or fictionalized by our memory. Freud even theorized that memories of our childhood are instead memories of memories, that the memory's emotional agenda has distorted our impressions of the past and colored our experiences. It may indeed be questioned whether we have any memories at all from our childhood. Memories relating to our childhood may be all that we possess. Our childhood memories show us our earliest years, not as they were, but as they appeared at the later periods when the memories were aroused. In these periods of arousal, the childhood memories did not, as people are accustomed to say, emerge. They were formed at that time, and a number of motives with no concern for historical accuracy had a part in forming them, as well as in the selection of the memories themselves. In other words, the way certain memories exist with such warm nostalgia can be seen as largely distorted and subjective. It's like when we think about the past, we aren't really seeing it for what it was, but almost like a copy of a memory, which then represents that time and is distorted by several factors like emotion. Now, whenever I talk about nostalgia, memories, and being delusional, I always point out that we are basically always projecting. Either consciously or subconsciously, our brains are subject to bias and seek comfort. And if you aren't careful, you will project a reality onto the world or past that doesn't exist. I've talked about this in past videos, but this applies to everything from crushes and relationships and creating a fantasy about a person to looking back on the past and convincing yourself that if you could just do X, Y, and Z, you would be able to recreate that past, when in reality, it only ever existed in your mind.
You can't repeat the past.
Can't repeat the past.
No.
Why, of course you can.
If we aren't careful, we will walk through life unknowingly projecting our fantasies and fears, delusions and desires onto the world all around us, setting ourselves up for disappointment and self-destruction. But I'll talk about that more later on in this video.
Yeah, 360. When you're in the mirror, do you like what you see? When you're in the mirror, you're just looking at me.
Let's talk about Generation Z.
Hands on your knees, Angelina Jolie. I'm sucking hands on the knees, Angelina Jolie. Hey, hands on the knees.
Honestly, whenever I think about us and our trends, what I immediately see is mass consumers cosplay. Our generation is constantly attempting to mimic some niche aesthetic they encountered online, thanks to our hyper-consumers culture and highly personalized algorithms. Gen Z is the fourth generation of the postmodern era after Millenials, Gen X, and to some extent boomers. And while some would argue that we are post-postmodernism, I would argue that we are in the truest version of it because of the sheer amount of information we see due to the internet. The idea of a collapse of meaning and a world where it seems no one can agree on what is true anymore, or really anything at all, has never been as real as it is today. The way in which social media has democratized our individual realities and how there is a niche for everyone, and the way people are so obsessed with simulating some idea or concept through their cores or aesthetics is the most postmodern simulacra thing I can think of.
They stare cause they know I'm the ITGIRL. You know I am that girl.
I mean, one of the biggest aesthetics right now is the Y2K trend, which is really just a simulation of the early 2000s that isn't even accurate, but is still replacing it with its representation. The Y2K aesthetic draws inspiration from the 2000s, but at the same time heavily deviates from it. And this is why I personally never liked Y2K fashion, as someone who can remember how people, including myself, dressed, because it was so random and messy and ugly. But what we paint as Y2K today is like an artificial, yesified, polished version of it. Honestly, the only celebrity that I'm aware of that accurately represents the fashion of that time is Pink Panthers. But to explain a bit more, I find it fascinating how many different levels of simulation there are within the online aesthetic core communities, and how we are at this point where new aesthetics today are being based on previous aesthetics that themselves were a mishmash of something previous as well. So off the top of my head, I think of Lana Del Rey, who is this simulation of mid-century Hollywood glamour. But now people have built off of Lana's aesthetic and added other artists and expanded it to Coquette, and it's become like the simulation of the simulation. It's like everyone is attempting to imitate some online core and simulate some version or idea of something that doesn't really exist outside of the internet. But this leads me to my other point about why Gen Z is so obsessed with simulating the past and our early 2000s childhood. I think one of the most obvious reasons for this is because it's just fun and comforting to do so. We believe that there is a critical period, analogous to imprinting in a baby chick, during which we tend to form strong preferences for whatever objects we frequently encounter. Say, music, movies, celebrities, clothing styles, automobile designs, or whatever. That our attachment to objects of nostalgic significance are determined in our formative years, from childhood to early adulthood, is a worthy observation. As such, these objects suggest a return to the safety of home.
From now on, our troubles will be miles away.
So by admiring the music, movies, and aesthetics of the past, we are reconnecting to a warm, familiar time that can make us momentarily feel safe and content. When the present is too chaotic and bleak, we can turn to the familiar past for comfort and solace. I see this as honestly an example of how our brains are basically always trying to protect us. Like, it's actually quite wholesome when I think about it. Like, when we go through incredibly traumatic events, our brains, to some extent, are incapable of accurately remembering the pain of those times, and for good reason. Your brain and body wants to keep you alive, and if we had instant, realistic access to all our traumatic moments, we wouldn't be able to cope and would probably all just die. This point can also explain why nostalgia exists at all. Our brains don't record all of our memories in the same way, with positive ones being vastly overrepresented and more accessible, making the past feel all around better regardless of what occurred during it. But the recognition that our brains don't always accurately record painful memories, or at times even allow us to access them at all, also can explain why people who had objectively traumatic pasts can sometimes still long for it and even rationalize that that time was better than the safe present. Now, one of the biggest reasons I wanted to make this video was this specific point and how I myself can relate to it. So I've gone through a lot, and like many people who have experienced some form of trauma, a lot of times we just want to distance ourselves from the environment where it took place, even if that means having to quit a job or move as far away as possible. So for me, I lived in a town that had a lot of bad, depressing memories, but I got pretty lucky and moved out of state. And it wasn't right away, but after about 2 years, I somehow, paradoxically, found myself feeling nostalgic for certain memories when I was in that environment, and was even almost romanticizing the sad and depressing aspects of it. It was like there was a soft comfort in the sadness of the past, and when I thought about it, I thought I was accurately seeing that past and what that depression was really like, but I wasn't. It was watered down and distorted. It wasn't until I really processed all the baggage and then moved back that idealized fantasy immediately dissolved, because now I was there and face to face with the reality. So it's like when the illusion of your memory is confronted by the physical environment it's based on, it will immediately be destroyed because you can't naively idealize it now that you are in it. I've noticed this with so many things, from people to memories and places. I remember when I was younger and there was this one guy I was so obsessed with, and I was like subconsciously constructing an alternate reality in my mind and projecting that onto him, only to get to know him and have that delusion shattered. Or another thing is that I was born and raised in Key West, Florida, but moved to New York in my teens, and after the move, my brain like martyred my hometown, and there was this almost oppressive nostalgia every time I thought about it until I visited later on and was immediately brought down to a more logical, objective reality. This has happened so many times about so many different things that now whenever I notice I'm experiencing nostalgia or romanticizing something or someone, I always remind myself that if I was physically at that time or place or with that person, I would probably realize that whatever I was imagining didn't really exist. So now that we covered how our brain tends to gaslight us, we should also talk about the other more tangible outside reasons for nostalgia. Now, we all inevitably experience nostalgia, especially as we age, but millennials and Gen Z are still experiencing it much more intensely and at a much younger age compared to older generations. Now, I think that there is more than one answer to this question, with one of them being obvious and the other not so much. So, a lot of this just has to do with what we experienced towards late childhood and early adulthood. We came to age during a time of endless wars, the beginning of political polarization, and to top it all off, the biggest recession since the Great Depression, which gutted the middle class. Now, these factors by themselves can obviously breed a lot of despair about the present, but when you factor in Trump winning in 2016, the political chaos that has followed ever since, and the second pandemic recession, how could anybody be surprised that we feel the way we do? 2 recessions in 10 years and the compiling of existential threats would lead anyone to look towards the past for comfort. As the paper discussed earlier, when we are faced with hard times, we tend to seek and find comfort in the past, especially the one that reminds us of the innocence and safety of childhood, where no matter how bad the world objectively was, we weren't able to really grasp it and therefore existed in a happier, carefree state. The second, and perhaps less obvious reason for all this is the internet and social media. The internet has completely democratized our world, but it hasn't led to the utopian interconnectedness that was promised. Thanks to neoliberalism, profits reign king, and to generate profit, you need engagement, which just so happens to best be made when the user is angry and irritated. What this means is that we are all unknowingly being trolled 24/7 in hopes that we'll get upset and either keep scrolling to feel better or maybe reply to someone in the comments and argue back and forth for eternity. What could possibly go wrong with this form of business model? I certainly can't think of any possible negative outcomes from this.
Donald Trump wins the presidency.
Political divide has become deadly with vaccine
Political
hesitancy driven by
disinformation is not a new
misinformation
concept, but it's
and the
mental
political
health crisis is an epidemic.
stormed the U.S. Capitol building.
Now, while the very real problems I mentioned earlier are reasons enough without algorithmic manipulation to feel some sense of despair and a longing for the past, what we consume on these apps also plays a big part in that. I know some studies say it's not proven and some say it's obvious, but at this point, as someone who has quit social media, I 100% understand how much depression, despair, division, and just overall negativity and overwhelm it causes. So it's like we have a world with very real, serious problems that need very real solutions, but now put a nonstop loop of doom and negativity in your face for 6 hours a day, and any sense of hope or positivity or solution will instantly be demolished. Again, I'm not trying to say the problems we face today shouldn't scare the shit out of us, but social media has made us so conditioned to negativity that anything positive, no matter how objective it is seen as highly suspicious or like some form of propaganda.
But this morning, for the first time, a new warning about something else: social media and what it means for kids' mental health.
There's a reason why depression skyrocketed after 2012 and the wide-scale adoption of the smartphone and social media. This gaslighting dopamine fear machine has so many of us in a stranglehold, which is creating an entire generation of hopeless, angry people who are desperate for some sort of relief, which they can easily find in the nostalgic, simpler memories of the past. Now, another thing that I think is pretty interesting about millennials and Gen Z specifically is that we literally grew up alongside the development of social media and the smartphone, so we can vividly remember a time before it and a time after. Being born any later and social media is the norm. born any earlier and it's completely foreign. I think I talked about this next part in a previous video, but I have this little theory that because our perception of the passage of time is really based on the amount of change happening in a certain period, and because the amount of change we've experienced is speeding up, we now feel older than we actually are. Really think about it though. The amount of social and technological change we have experienced in just like 25 years is incredible. When I think about before the iPhone and social media, or even just before 2016, it honestly feels like it was 3 decades ago, and at this point, it's hard to keep up with all the new craziness that's always happening. I think all this can cause us to feel older than we are, making us feel even more nostalgic for a past that feels unnaturally further and further away. When you really think about it though, our generation has basically been living through consistent destabilization. From the wars in the Middle East, to the Great Recession, the introduction of social media, Trump, the pandemic, Ukraine, and all beginning with the attacks in 2001. I remember growing up and people saying that this attack was the moment the 90s ended and the 2000s began, and when the optimism of the 90s died. Everyone kept saying that this was a bad omen for how the 21st century was going to play out and that it would end up defining it. Now, I remember thinking to myself, that is such an over-exaggeration. This was just a one-time horrifying event. But when you think about it, what was 9/11? It was the unthinkable becoming a reality. Something that completely destabilized the way the world has been functioning and boldly challenged our naive perceptions of safety and stability. So far, I think that description perfectly defines the 21st century. Event after event after event, even as recent as 2 weeks ago with the Supreme Court, makes us feel that we are living in some alternate Simpsons timeline where the unimaginable has basically become the expected. Out of everything I've talked about in this video, I think that perhaps this is the biggest reason why we long for the past. We got lucky to be born just in time to experience a taste of normalcy before the world flipped upside down, and the unbelievably depressing state of it now would make anyone desperately cling to a time right before it all went to shit.